It was just a wooden bridge to some people. A weathered, creaking span barely wide enough for a truck to cross, sitting quietly over a narrow stream that cut through my land. But to me, it was the heart of my property. My grandfather built that bridge long before I was born, back when our family used to run cattle through the valley. I remember him telling me stories of the first time he laid the beams across that stream, using nothing but hand tools, grit, and help for neighbors. He built it strong, not just to last through floods, but to last through generations. That bridge was how my father brought supplies in, how he hauled lumber out, and how I'd planned to someday drive my daughter across as she started working the land with me. It wasn't just a piece of infrastructure. It was part of our story, a physical memory that carried the weight of decades. Every time I crossed it, I thought about all the footprints that came before mine. My granddad's boots, my dad's truck tires, even my own horse when I was younger, riding bareback across the wooden planks to round up stray cattle. It was something rooted in history, in family, in respect for the land, and what we built with our own hands. That bridge didn't belong to the county. It wasn't part of any road plan. It sat squarely on private property, legally mine, protected by every document I owned. But then the resort came. They didn't ask. They didn't meet with me. They didn't even send a letter. One morning, I woke up to the sound of machines rumbling across the earth like a storm rolling in. I stepped outside and saw them, contractors, bulldozers, and surveyors all stomping across my fields like they owned it. I wasn't given a notice, and I certainly didn't give any permission. I drove up to the creek, thinking maybe they were just trespassing again, like they had before when they cut down trees too close to my fence line. But this time was different. This time they were standing right on my bridge. It was already half-gutted, boards ripped out, nails scattered in the dirt. One of them was swinging a chainsaw over the main beam, while another gave hand signals to the excavator. I slammed on the brakes and jumped out of the truck, yelling, asking what the hell they thought they were doing. One guy in a reflective vest barely looked at me before shrugging and saying, "Just following orders. It's in the plans." Plans? What plans? Not mine. Not the county's. The resort had drawn up their own blueprints and decided that my bridge was in the way of their landscape vision. They didn't just destroy wood. They tore down history. They took something they didn't understand, didn't value, and ripped it out like it was a weed. And they did it fast, like they were afraid of being caught, but sure I couldn't stop them. I stood there, watching a legacy vanish plank by plank, replaced by piles of debris and tire tracks. There wasn't time to stop it. By the time I could get the sheriff out there, it was gone. The damage was done, but it wasn't over. I knew that bridge sat directly over the only easement they had access to, the only place they could legally run power, water, and internet lines from the public utility pole to their resort. It wasn't something I made public, and clearly, they hadn't done their research. That bridge wasn't just sentimental. It was strategic. The easement agreement was conditional. My consent, my terms, and revocable if the land was altered without written approval. And guess what they never had? They thought I'd just be another landowner too afraid to push back. They thought their lawyers and investors would be enough to bulldoze not just my bridge, but my rights, my story, my ground. They were wrong. What they took from me wasn't just personal. It was deeply connected to the land, the law, and everything they overlooked in their arrogance. The first time I heard about the resort development, it was through a neighbor who mentioned some investors were eyeing our side of the county for a luxury wilderness experience. At first, I didn't think much of it. People talk, rumors fly, and developers dream big. But then the trucks started rolling in, surveyors with clipboards, drones buzzing overhead, and engineers taking soil samples not far from my property line. That's when I knew it was real. Still, I figured they'd reach out, at least out of courtesy. Maybe schedule a meeting, maybe introduce themselves. But nothing came. No calls, no letters, no knocking on the door. Just silence. They went around me, like I didn't exist. Then one day, I spotted orange flags staked into the ground about 20 feet from my fence. I followed the line of markers with my eyes, and that's when I saw the laminated map duct taped to a post. It was their development plan. A sprawling resort with cabins, zip lines, horseback trails, and an artificial lake. The map even labeled my stream, as part of their natural feature showcase. I wasn't angry yet. Confused, maybe. A little cautious. But still hopeful it was just a misunderstanding. A few days later, the first bulldozer crossed onto my property. I confronted the crew. They shrugged and said they were told this area was part of the access path. I told them they were trespassing. They rolled back their machinery, but left the ground torn up and didn't even fix the gate they'd broken. That was when I started looking into the developer, an out-of-state company with a shiny website full of drone footage, PR buzzwords, and fake smiles. Their press release said they were working closely with local landowners. That was a lie. They never contacted me because they thought they didn't have to. They thought they were above asking. These weren't folks trying to build something alongside the community. They were steamrolling through it. One of their reps showed up once after I'd already filed a complaint with the county. He stood in my driveway in his polished shoes, telling me how good the resort would be for property values. When I asked him why they were using my bridge for construction access, he acted surprised, like he didn't know. I pulled out my land deed and pointed to the boundary lines. His smile faltered. That was the last I ever saw of him. But the crews kept coming. They brought in concrete mixers, gravel trucks, and heavy equipment, and each time they edged closer to my land. When I caught them dumping runoff into the creek, I called environmental services. When they cut down old-growth trees near the fence line, I called forestry. Still, the county moved slow. These developers knew how to play the game. They had teams of lawyers and a list of backroom handshake deals, but they also had one big weakness. They never bothered to understand the land they were building on. They assumed I wouldn't notice when they parked their equipment on my property. They assumed I wouldn't read the easement contract from 1982 that clearly stated any changes to the terrain must be approved in writing. They assumed I'd be another passive landowner who didn't know his rights. They assumed wrong. When they tore down the bridge, they claimed it was safety-related and non-essential. But that bridge sat directly over the route they needed to connect their resort to utilities. It was the only viable path for underground lines and vehicle access, and their development plans hinged on it. Without it, they'd have to reroute everything through protected land or private parcels they didn't own. It was reckless, and more than that, it was entitled. Their arrogance wasn't just legal overreach. It was personal. It was the assumption that their money and vision mattered more than my history, my land, my family. They didn't just build without asking. They bulldozed trust before they ever broke ground. This wasn't about progress. It was about power. They came in acting like kings of the valley, expecting everyone to fall in line. But when you ignore the people who live on the land, when you erase them from the blueprint, you're building on nothing but sand. I had kept the easement agreement in a fireproof lockbox for years, along with my land title and water rights. It wasn't something I ever expected to pull out, but I knew it mattered. My grandfather had signed it back in 1982 with the electric co-op, allowing them, and only them, access through a specific corridor of our property to run lines and maintain the infrastructure. It was a narrow easement, maybe 20 feet wide, and it ran directly under the bridge they just tore down. That spot wasn't chosen at random. It was the only place flat enough, dry enough, and close enough to the main road to legally run utilities without damaging the creek or crossing neighboring property. It was the lifeline, the one thread tying future development on that side of the ridge to actual functionality. What the developers didn't realize, or maybe didn't care to ask, was that without that easement, their entire $4 million resort was little more than a dream sketched on paper. I had never denied access because I never had a reason to, until they destroyed what was on top of it. That bridge wasn't just a family heirloom. It was a part of the easement's original design. The utility co-op built their conduits to follow the bridge's exact path. The pipes, the cable channels, the drainage systems, they were all laid in a straight line that started at the county pole and ran under the bridge's foundation. Take out the bridge, and you didn't just remove planks of wood. You removed the protection for the infrastructure. You disrupted service, access, and legal compliance. And that's exactly what they did. Without notifying the utility company, without rerouting the path, and without approval from anyone who actually had authority, the resort contractors demolished the one part of the easement that made everything work. The workers didn't even know there were active fiber lines beneath the structure. They just assumed it was an old rural footbridge. That kind of ignorance doesn't just cost money, it risks entire operations. When the co-op found out, they weren't happy. When I showed them photos and timelines, they confirmed what I already knew. Any destruction of the easement without landowner and utility approval violated the original contract. And that violation gave me the right to revoke access. The resort needed electricity, water, internet, all of it. And all of that depended on the uninterrupted use of that narrow strip of land that now sat full of debris and legal headaches. I wrote a formal notice of revocation, citing Clause 4 of the easement agreement, and delivered it to both the developer and the county. It wasn't a bluff. It wasn't emotional retaliation. It was a legally binding, fully enforceable action. Their crews had dismantled protected access. That wasn't just unethical, it was unlawful. The engineers scrambled. I got emails from their office within 24 hours. We'd love to discuss a resolution. We'd be happy to fund new bridge. Can we schedule a call to talk terms? But by then, I had already retained legal counsel, and I wasn't interested in quick fix apologies. If they wanted access again, they'd have to refile for a new easement, and that required my signature. And I wasn't signing anything. What stung them most wasn't the legal loss. It was the delay. Every day the resort sat idle cost them thousands. Their investors expected progress. Their timeline was tight. Without utilities, they couldn't lay concrete, install HVAC, or open a single building. They couldn't even host preview events or offer pre-sale packages to their members. All because they failed to do their homework. When I walked that land and looked at the gash where the bridge used to be, I didn't feel victorious. I felt justified. They gambled on my silence. They gambled on my ignorance. And in doing so, they gambled away the one legal path they had to bring power and water to their project. The irony wasn't lost on me. They destroyed the thing they needed most, thinking it was an obstacle when it was actually their lifeline. The contractors who had been so confident weeks before were now idle, leaning against equipment that couldn't move. The site manager avoided eye contact when I passed by. The office trailer that once buzzed with activity sat dark. They hadn't just lost access, they lost momentum. Because the truth about land is it remembers. It remembers who builds with care and who takes without asking. And sometimes the very ground they wanted to develop decides who gets to stay and who doesn't. After the bridge was destroyed and I confirmed the developers had violated the original easement agreement, I didn't hesitate. I gathered every document I needed, photographs of the damage, the signed easement contract from 1982, notes from the utility co-op inspector, and my property line survey. I wanted everything lined up, not just for legal backup, but because I knew what was coming. I filed for an immediate termination of the easement. Not a delay, not a warning. A full and final revocation, backed by both property law and breach of contract. I had every right. They had altered the land without permission. They had destroyed protected infrastructure. And they had done so with full knowledge that they were operating without formal agreements. The county clerk's office processed the revocation faster than I expected. I hand-delivered a copy to the resort's corporate office and sent another by certified mail to their project manager. It wasn't long before their legal team responded. At first, it was a polite inquiry. They wanted to clarify the terms of the easement. Then came the offers. First, a request to rebuild the bridge at their expense. Then a proposal to increase their compensation for the use of the easement. But it was too late for that. The breach had already occurred. And the contract was crystal clear. Any alteration of the terrain or access without landowner consent rendered the easement null and void. They tried to argue that the bridge was old, unsafe, and not structurally sound. I had an inspection report from less than a year earlier showing the bridge was in good condition. I had even reinforced its beams myself the previous spring. Their excuses didn't hold up. The truth was simple. They assumed control over something they didn't own. And now, they had to deal with the consequences. Their lawyers kept trying to negotiate, but I didn't budge. I wasn't interested in money. I wasn't interested in compromise. They had disrespected my land, destroyed my history, and treated me like I was some obstacle to bulldoze. So I followed the law. Every word in that easement contract was now working against them, and they had no legal ground to stand on. Without access through my property, their utility plans were dead in the water. There were no alternative easements on neighboring parcels, and rerouting would mean cutting through environmentally protected land, a process that could take years and require approval from 3 different state departments. I started getting calls from the utility companies, too. They informed the developers that without a valid easement, they couldn't legally proceed with installation. The co-op had no choice but to halt all scheduled work. The fiber company pulled their crews. The water district put a hold on the connection request. I watched all of it from my porch. The construction site sat frozen. Piles of material stacked high and untouched. Equipment parked in the dirt with no operators in sight. Time was working against them, and they knew it. A few weeks after the termination was finalized, the developers made one last effort. This time, they sent a regional director to my door. He wore a blazer, polished shoes, and had a folder full of revised site plans. He promised minimal impact. He apologized for the oversight. He offered to build a new bridge, restore the creek side to better than before, and even name it in honor of my grandfather. I let him talk. Then I told him the same thing I told his lawyers. I wasn't signing another easement. Not now, not ever. That was the moment they realized I wasn't bluffing. They thought landowners could be bought off or pressured into compliance. But they never understood that my decision wasn't about revenge. It was about respect. And if they couldn't respect the land, they didn't deserve to build on it. I filed for a formal injunction next, just to make sure they couldn't attempt any work around the easement area. My attorney helped draft it. It passed without opposition. The resort was officially blocked from continuing construction until they could secure a new legal access point, which didn't exist. The local paper picked up the story. Word spread through the county. Neighbors started asking questions. Other landowners who had been pushed around by developers began pulling their own easement agreements to see what rights they still had. What started as a quiet legal filing turned into something bigger. It became an example of what happens when developers ignore the fine print, when they prioritize speed and profits over people and property. The bridge was gone, but now, so was their future. Because in their rush to build, they forgot the most important step, earning the right to be here in the first place. When the easement was officially terminated and construction ground to a halt, the impact on the resort project was immediate and devastating. What was once a buzzing hive of activity, with trucks rumbling in and out and workers hustling from dawn to dusk, suddenly became a silent, stalled zone. For weeks, all progress ceased. You could almost hear the sound of panic coming from inside their sleek office trailer. The resort had been running on momentum, with investors pushing hard to meet their projected opening date, and every passing day, without access to utilities, chipped away at their confidence. The first sign of trouble was the sudden disappearance of their marketing team. The colorful signs that once stood at the edge of the road, boasting "Opening soon, reserve your luxury escape," were quietly removed. Their website, which had once featured a countdown timer and flashy drone videos, now redirected to a maintenance page. They stopped answering questions on social media. Local contractors who had been hired to work on the cabins started complaining that checks were late or communication had gone dark altogether. It was clear the developers were scrambling behind the scenes, but from where I stood, their options were drying up fast. Their biggest issue was time. Construction loans don't wait. Investor confidence doesn't last forever, and contractors won't sit idle while the clock ticks. By the 3rd month of standstill, crews began to leave. Subcontractors pulled out entirely, citing breach of contract. Equipment rental companies showed up with flatbeds to haul away idle machines. Vendors who had been lined up to supply everything from custom tiles to furniture canceled their orders. The ripple effect of that single revoked easement was enormous. Without access to utilities, electricity, water, and data, nothing else could proceed. They couldn't install HVAC systems, plumbing, lighting, security, or fire suppression. And because the site was classified as a commercial development, none of the buildings could pass inspection without a fully operational utility infrastructure. They tried everything to salvage the project. I heard from neighbors that the developers were offering premium payments to any surrounding landowner who would grant them a new easement. But that valley was tight-knit, and most of the nearby properties had conservation agreements or agricultural protections in place. Even if someone had wanted to sell access, the legal red tape alone would have taken years to clear. And no one wanted to get dragged into a mess that big, especially after seeing what had happened with my land. I started receiving more letters. Offers grew more desperate. At first, they were financial, 6 figures for a signature. Then came the emotional appeals. One letter talked about jobs lost and families, depending on the resort's success. Another mentioned how disappointed their investors were and begged for a compromise. I read each one carefully and kept them all. But the answer never changed. I had made a decision, and I wasn't about to walk it back because they were feeling the consequences of their own recklessness. The county, which had originally welcomed the resort as a boost to tourism, started to reconsider its stance. Public opinion shifted. Locals who had been hopeful about new business now voiced concerns about how the development had ignored property lines and pushed rural families too far. A community board meeting was held, and I showed up with a binder full of documents, maps, easement contracts, photos, correspondence. I laid all out. The crowd was silent as I explained how a legally protected access route had been destroyed without permission and how the developers had treated the people already living on that land as if they were in the way. In the following weeks, the county issued a hold on all further permits related to the project. They cited unresolved utility access, environmental disruption, and failure to maintain proper contractor licensing as just a few of the reasons. The final blow came when a lien was filed by one of the primary contractors. Millions of dollars in unpaid invoices piling up while construction remained frozen. Eventually, the resort stopped responding. Their trailers were emptied out. Lockford changed. The gravel paths they carved across the meadow were overgrown with weeds. A rusting cement mixer sat half-sunk in the mud, surrounded by abandoned pallets. What had once been a high-end vision now looked like a ghost town. The $4 million investment was now just wasted potential scattered across unfinished foundations and broken promises. The land had won, or maybe more accurately, the truth had won. The truth that land, especially land with history and care, can't just be taken for granted. They thought tearing down my bridge was just a minor inconvenience, an easy sacrifice in the name of progress. To them, it was an old, rickety span that was standing in the way of their vision boards and investor meetings. They didn't see the generations that had crossed it, or the work that went into building it, or the meaning it held for the family that lived on the land long before their development plans ever existed. They saw a nuisance. I saw a legacy. And when they destroyed it without permission, they didn't just remove a structure. They triggered a chain of events they never saw coming. That bridge represented more than access. It was the physical connection between two halves of my property, the thread that tied together history, utility, and sovereignty. And they took it apart like it was nothing, without so much as a conversation, let alone consent. They thought I'd get angry, shout into the void, maybe file a complaint, and wait years for a hearing that would go nowhere. What they didn't count on was that I knew the law. I knew the land. I knew what they'd broken. And I knew how to respond, not with noise, but with action. They brought blueprints and arrogance. I brought records, deeds, and clauses they clearly never read. I pulled the plug, not metaphorically, but literally. I removed the one piece of legal infrastructure they needed to move forward. Their permits were useless without utilities. Their project was frozen without power and water. Their contractors couldn't work. Their investors got nervous. Time started working against them, fast. I watched as the trailers emptied out, as the project managers started rotating like a revolving door. They tried replacing people, as if it was just a communication issue. But the real issue wasn't confusion. It was consequence. They acted first and thought later. They bulldozed before they built relationships. And they violated the very easement that gave them the right to be there in the first place. The deeper irony was that they weren't just blocked from continuing. They were entirely cut off from salvaging what they had already done. Everything they had poured money into, grading, clearing, partial foundations, was now trapped behind a legal wall they couldn't tear down. They tried to cut deals with nearby landowners, but the community was watching now, and no one wanted to get involved in something that had already turned into a legal and public relations disaster. At first, they tried to spin the story. There were whispers that the landowner, me, was being unreasonable, that I was holding progress hostage, that I was clinging to a bridge out of spite. But every attempt to flip the narrative fell flat once the facts started circulating. The easement was conditional. The bridge was on private land. The destruction was unauthorized. The law was on my side, and I had the paper trail to prove it. And slowly, everything they tried to ignore or silence started surfacing. The rushed approvals, the failure to notify adjacent landowners, the environmental corners they cut. They came in trying to build an empire, but they couldn't even keep their foundation stable. And without a bridge, both literal and legal, they had nowhere left to go. The final insult to injury was watching the resort's promotional materials quietly vanish. No more digital ads. No more construction updates. No more calls to book your slice of serenity. The investors walked away. The county pulled support. Their silence said everything. The resort was dead, and my land was still standing. I never wanted a fight. I never asked for conflict. But when someone comes onto your land, disregards your rights, destroys what matters to you, and acts like you don't matter, they leave you with no other option. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't chain myself to the bridge. I let the truth do the work. I let the law back me up. I let their own mistakes catch up to them. They thought tearing down my bridge would open a path to profit. But all it really did was close the door on their entire project. Because power doesn't come from bulldozers and blueprints. It comes from knowing where you stand and not moving when someone tries to push you off your own land. It comes from refusing to be erased. It comes from drawing a line, not out of spite, but out of principle, and holding it firm no matter how much pressure they apply.